Alright, what's going on, folks? This particular video, you can tell exactly what this is, but we're going old school YouTube. This is a response video. This is not a reaction video. I've already watched this particular video. I know who this is. She holds clout in the industry. Very well earned and deserved clout. So I'm going to let her do her shtick. So let's get into it.
Hello friends, I'm Alanah and welcome to my channel. For anyone who doesn't know me, and solely because it is relevant to what we're going to be talking about in this video, I've been working in the games industry for just under a decade. I worked for IGN full-time for 3 years, reviewed a lot of games from them, for them, and started out in print magazines and have worked for a bunch of different websites, including many of the major ones whose names you know. Basically, I feel like I have the experience to talk about what I'm talking about today for any of you who have no idea who I am. Moving on. This is going to be kind of a tough video because there are certain topics that, especially when you work in games media, are really hard to talk about. To give you a very good example, I played Mass Effect Andromeda long before it came out. The whole world was very excited about Mass Effect Andromeda. And I played it for about 3 hours, and I walked out of the room and was crushed because I had the thought, oh no, it's bad. I can't lie in good conscience and tell the internet that it's good, but because they want to hear that it's good, when I say it's bad, they're going to fucking hate me. Therein lies a complicated issue with covering any kind of fan media as your job in any critical way. Saying that I thought Mass Effect Andromeda was going to be bad, again, at a point in time where it seemed like the whole world thought it was going to be good, meant that I did get a lot of shit on the internet for a long time. But point being, I knew people didn't want to hear it, just like I know people don't really want to hear what I'm saying in this video. And it would be a lot easier for me to tell you that games journalists are corrupt and paid off, because that's what you want to hear. That would get me a lot of positive comments, and it would get me a lot of subscribers, and it would be shared, it would get a lot of views. That is the thing that would put me in good favor with the internet, and I am aware of that. But that is not the truth. There is nuance to that, and I'm going to get into it here. I'm going to talk about my genuine experiences. Touched on this in other videos and a bunch of facets of this in other videos, but this is just one video about this one thing. So I'm just going to ask you, the internet, and I know it's not going to work, but I'm going to try, to keep in mind that it is difficult for people like me to talk about this topic honestly because you may not want to hear it. But honesty should, I feel like, be the thing that we want the most. I feel like we can all agree on that. I don't feel like either side of this, the media side or the public side, always do a good job of executing on that. So I'm just going to ask you, try to watch this video with an open mind. That's it. I am trying to give you an inside perspective. I'm not trying to reinforce things that aren't true, because frankly, it would benefit me way more if I lied. So, first,
Okay, so I've watched this. I wanted her to be able to present her point. So I want to commend Alanah for actually being willing to be upfront, honest, have an open dialogue, open discussion, and transparency. I sit in this weird in-between because at one point for about 3 years, I did what she did. I dealt with publishers, game review codes, content, setting up interviews, with developers, dealing with PR agencies that people don't tell you about. There's a lot of stuff on the back end that a lot of gamers don't understand until they get into it. That's not counting the package deals that you get for ad banners and everything else. So when most gamers will throw the transparency and objectivity and all the other crap, and they always point to the Jeff Gerstmann situation, which was, for those that don't know, around 2007. Jeff Gerstmann was the editor-in-chief, one of the higher editors in GameSpot, and he reviewed Kane and Lynch, gave it like a 6. Basically, it was just saying it was a meh game. It wasn't good. There's very few good things about it. There just happened to be a whole crap ton of Kane and Lynch advertising across the website for GameSpot. The same time the review came out, Capcom got a little mad, and the parent company who dealt with the package deals that you get when it comes to advertising and related content and all the other stuff. Didn't like that because Capcom went to them. So Gersman was stepped out of that role, shall we say. And that's kind of what everybody points at as far as the lack of transparency. The industry hasn't really helped itself by not discussing the more inner workings on how stuff works. On the same note, the gamer perspective, we have not done a good job of listening and presenting like, hey, you guys just suck at transparency. There are other, as Alanah puts it, there are other nuances that go into this. And there's some, it rolls into something she talks about far later in this video. So I'm going to try to keep this really short, but I can appreciate the open, honest, and transparent dialogue she wants to have. So I'm not going to lambast, like, this is not going to be the typical video you guys would expect from me, because I want to have an honest conversation. And I think it's one that needs to be had. And again, I sit in a weird spot because I can see the game community perspective, and I can see the game media perspective because I've done both.
Last thing that I want to talk about is not directly related to that, and to a lot of you might seem obvious, but is a thing that I notice that the internet gets confused about all the time that has come up this week specifically. The Last of Us Part 2 is getting a lot of 10 out of 10 review scores. I do not personally agree with these scores. Frankly, I would not have given The Last of Us Part 2 a 10 out of 10. However, that doesn't make me any more correct than the people who do believe it is a 10 out of 10, and I genuinely do believe that they think that. The one note that keeps being brought up to me is people saying, well, it has flaws, how can it be a 10 out of 10? Which is where I pull up the IGN is most people's go-to. God, this chair's taking up so much screen. So if IGN is most people's go-to for scores, they do get the most traffic on their reviews historically. And obviously I can talk about IGN as I worked there as a full-time employee. Let's talk about the IGN review scale. A 10 out of 10 is not perfect. That's really it. A lot of you, again, probably already know this point, but I want to jump to it off the bat. 10 out of 10 does not mean a game is perfect. Nothing is perfect. On IGN scale, a 10 is listed as a masterpiece, and I generally agree with that. A 10 should be very difficult to get, and I do believe there are pieces of IGN's past where they gave out 10s way too readily, but I digress. 10 out of 10 is not a perfect game. On a directly related point, 5 is not average. And I think that audiences who put so much weight in review scores, which by the way is why these major websites still have review scores. People complain about the scores all the time. Comment sections, people are always talking about them. They're getting shares. The more audience puts weight on scores, the more it reinforces to these websites that they need to have scores because their audiences clearly really care about them. And they get traffic from them. So 5 is mediocre. That does not mean average. The reason that you get so many game review scores that are around the 7 range is because, frankly, most of the games that these major sites are reviewing, or major magazines or whatever are reviewing, are really fucking good. If you only play AAA games, which, let's be honest, most gamers do, then you only see the games that are getting 8s, 9s, and 10s because they are usually extremely high quality. I mean, Fallout 76 and Crackdown 3 apparently both got a 5, so that's worth noting. Those are AAA. But it doesn't mean that there are no games that fall below 5. Games come out every single day that would be considered bad or unplayable or broken. But IGN isn't going to waste most of its time reviewing all of those games because A, it's impossible. But B, audiences don't generally even care about those games. That's the shovelware that shows up on the Nintendo Switch eShop. That's half of the junk that shows up on Steam. So yes, loads and loads and loads of bad games exist. You just don't see them reviewed because nobody's even going to pay attention to those reviews.
So let's be honest. Niche games are not going to draw numbers. At the end of the day, games media is a business. Their business is to drive traffic, to drive numbers. So they're going to review the stuff that does just that. The Assassin's Creeds, etc. That's just what it is. However, one thing that the games media does not do well is pushing word of mouth for more indie projects at times. And I'll get into something I have to say about that later, but there is stuff the games media side can do a whole lot better than they do. because it becomes you get to a point where it's like, hey, press release, hey, it makes a lot of the game's media outlets look like just overglorified PR agencies or extensions of the EA PR, branch. That's kind of the perception. They're not necessarily wrong, because when you go to a website, Kotaku, IGN, GameSpot, PC Gamer, and all those kind of websites, and you basically read the same press release about gameplay, etc., release dates. How does it not seem like it's just you're a PR agency for the game companies at that point? That's just my take. Just saying. So a little more on the less AAA stuff would be great, because that creates the word of mouth. The word of mouth is what drives game recommendations, game sales, etc.
For the most part. 10 is not perfect. 5 is not average. 5 is mediocre. A 7 or an 8 probably is the average aggregate score, because majority of the games that are being reviewed simply are good. And I feel like that covers a whole lot of the conversation and the discourse that I've seen surrounding The Last of Us Part 2, where people have said, well, this review even lists flaws. How is it a 10 out of 10? It is still considered a masterpiece by that reviewer. That's the case. Another thing that I want...
Okay, so she's getting to the thing that I really wanted to talk about, but reviews, game reviews. That last part, she said, she believes that reviewer believes that score. Here's the thing. Game reviews are subjectivity in the guise of objectivity. You try to give as many objective points and cross comparisons in whatever you're trying to describe, so people have frame of reference to make that comparison to. But really, at the end of it all, it's one dude on one website or one person's opinion. Yes, it's marked as, well, IGN says blah, blah, blah. That's correlation, that's correlation based off relation. You can't really do that. Well, okay, this person's opinion does not necessarily correlate to the overall every reviewer at IGN or GameSpot or, pick a review site. But the correlation is, this is the final score IGN gives something. And that's fine, but I think having the name association build higher than, say, IGN would probably help a lot, or a GameSpot review, etc. That's just my take. So gamers need to understand that it's subjectivity in the guise of objectivity. Until they understand that, there's always going to be that misrepresentation. It's on the gamer to understand that, and that requires having an open mind. I want to get into the thing she's really going to talk about here, and that is, I'll let her discuss.
I want to talk about is Metacritic, because this is a thing that people also don't know. Metacritic doesn't actually accurately just aggregate scores. There are a couple of games at play where Metacritic is concerned. For one, there are a number of negative reviews of The Last of Us Part 2 that are unscored. If we click here, Polygon's review is unscored and says, Part 2 ends up feeling needlessly bleak at a time when a nihilistic worldview has perhaps never been less attractive. The Vice is also negative. The Last of Us Part 2 feels complacent, yet also preoccupied with its predecessor. Every facet of the original game has been expanded on and enlarged in the sequel, but not actually improved. Kotaku, same thing. None of those accomplishments elevated or redeemed it for me, like the nature consuming Seattle or the outbreak consuming humanity. Its ugliness overshadowed everything else. These don't have scores. I would say they're probably more likely to be mixed than they are to be inherently negative, but what Metacritic will often do is try to score the unscored reviews itself. They will kind of guess and then add a score, and maybe they'll do that eventually for these ones that are currently unscored, but they do that. They also weight different outlets' review scores differently. So like IGN, because it is, The Guardian would be one as well, Game Informer, because they are considered reputable outlets, they get a higher weight than other websites that Metacritic might not be familiar with do. So that is also a thing that is worth noticing. You're putting way too much stock into Metacritic, is basically my point.
She's not wrong. Okay, so here's the whole point. I've known for years that Metacritic has done weighted review. Like what they claim as an aggregation is not a true aggregation. And some of this is on the industry as a whole. And I'm going to point fingers at publishers, developers, etc., and developers signing deals. You know, you heard about Obsidian not getting their, I believe, royalty bonus. There was some type of bonus they didn't get because they didn't hit a particular score on Metacritic. That to me is putting way too much stock in a system that is so broken to start with, but claims to be a neutral aggregator. When you're weighing sites, that's based off your personal take on what's a founding reputable source. That becomes a problem. For me, I think the industry needs to, like the gaming industry, there is a better site called OpenCritic that the industry should be backing. It is a true review aggregation site. There is no weight to a website, so they don't judge how something is better or worse, etc. It is a true review aggregation site. They have prerequisites in order to get onto that review, but once you're on there, it is not considered any weighted nonsense. OpenCritic is far better than Metacritic. Hands down. I cannot make that recommendation enough. And the industry shoots itself in the foot by allowing this nonsense. So I'm blaming game media. I'm blaming gamers for putting any stock in it. I'm blaming a lot of people across the board for allowing this bullshit website to basically dictate the flow and how the industry operates. Because to me, it is a bullshit website. You cannot sit there and claim to be a review aggregation website when you aggregate scores, but you also weigh them as how much they are worth. And the fact that you decide to score stuff yourself, for those that don't actually have review scores like Kotaku, says a lot about that system. It's broken. There are far better. Go to OpenCritic. I wish more people would push for that in the industry, because Metacritic is shit. And she is right. There is way too much stock put into it, from top to bottom, from gamer to publisher, and everybody in between. You're all to blame for that system.
It is also a very subjective outlet in a lot of ways. Obviously, the public continues to have this idea that reviews are paid off, or that reviewers are giving The Last of Us Part 2 a 10 out of 10 because they don't want to be blacklisted from getting more review copies from Sony. The only time that I have ever heard of Sony being annoyed at an outlet where review copies was concerned was when they broke embargo. An outlet agreed to not talk about a certain thing or do something, and the outlet did it. You are not giving The Last of Us a 10 out of 10 so Sony will give you more review copies. They wouldn't do it. And the truth is, if that's a thing that you're worried about, I think that you should be getting angry at Sony and Sony PR and the embargoes that they did put on The Last of Us Part 2 that prevent people from talking about a lot of the second half of the game. But I also 100% believe that this is this dude's opinion. This is how Jonathan feels about this game. Knowing this guy personally, I am positive that he at no point thought, I better give this game a 10 so IGN can get more reviews. Because
something I want to mention here. Basically, I believe it was Kotaku who blackballed, and it's Kotaku, so whatever. Screw Jason Schreier. And that lot, I'm not a fan personally. That's just. Anyway, the whole thing about this is, at the end of the day, you're talking about something that you guys agree to, though. You say get mad at Sony PR. And yeah, they're part of it, but you're also culpable for it for agreeing to it. Things like your review embargoes, so that they can worry about pre-orders and all the other nonsense that goes with it, is not doing the consumer, the customer, the gamer any favors either. So it's this weird, like, symbiotic relationship that games media has with PR, and it's not a relationship that's really discussed. It's kind of stays under the bridge, that people don't really discuss about it. But one thing I've noticed is that a lot of people who are in games media end up going into game development or the PR end of gaming. Some are community managers who go into for a publisher or developer, who go and work for a PR agency that promote for video games and stuff. This cross-pollination makes it really hard, though, because what ends up happening is you've worked with these people before. You might even be friends with these people. So separating out the personal and the business aspect and what you do is really hard, because you rely on those personal connections for those business connections. And sometimes if you piss somebody off based off, you break an embargo, or you agree to it, the fact that you agree to it, that's your fault. But those symbiotic relationships create murky waters, and that's a lot of the problem. And a lot of it's the industry's own doing. You as an example, like, once you get past the PR agency gatekeeping, you can go and pretty much talk to any developer you want. They don't care. Well, once you get past the PR nonsense that is like PAX East registration or PAX West registration for games media, you can get into pretty much anything. The symbiotic relationship becomes even more of a problem when you go to events like PAX or a Comic-Con. Because what ends up happening is there's a lot of parties and stuff, like after, if you can call it, for networking, but they're free drinks. There's free drinks, free food, swag. So it's an influential thing, and there are certain things that people won't talk about. The most infamous one I can tell you right now is the PC gamer party for PAX East every year. Nobody talks about it, but most of the there's always game demos. The last year I went was when they were doing the new Wolfenstein at the time, and you got to play that before everybody else. But the thing is, there's caveats to it, like, oh, you can't take pictures, oh, you can't show gameplay, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. So, or else, you're blacklisted. So the symbiotic nature of PR and games media is too intertwined. There's not a clear delineation a lot of the times. And that's a problem, because that leads to a perception problem, which is something that the industry doesn't like to talk about.
Writers are a bunch of pretentious idiots, myself included, who care so much more about their own integrity and how their peers view their integrity than they care about publishers. Quickly jumping back in here on this note, because I feel like I phrased what I said poorly initially. This is my biggest criticism of games journalism, is that I do think in a lot of cases writers write things for their peers rather than for the audience. While that still means they're being honest, it does mean that we have all of these reviewers who, in the case of The Last of Us, are buying into high art because they're very passionate about the games industry and very passionate about storytelling in video games. That is their perspective. But it is also not necessarily the perspective that that most people who are going to read your review are going to share. That is a complicated topic as well. But yes, my number one criticism of games media is that I think that a lot of journalists write things for their Twitter followers who also work in the industry, more so than they do for the people who read the website. Back to the original video. But also, very important note, when I published the negative piece about Mass Effect Andromeda,
And to her point, she is correct because, and the thing is, Twitter is a fucking echo chamber. Social media is a fucking echo chamber. Like, these type of discussions don't happen on Twitter or Facebook. Like, these are not plausible discussions to have because 280 characters, 140 characters, whatever limit Twitter decides to fucking put on it, or social media platform you're using, they're all garbage for actual communication. So yes, a lot of writers and games media personalities who write for these websites, they write for the audience they follow, as opposed to the audience that and the demographics of their site. And that's a problem too. Or the core values of their site. Excuse me. Like, that is a problem. And one that kind of needs to be addressed. Like, you either write about or believe in the core values of a business, a website, whatever, and you believe in following those, or you're gonna go and run to the echo chamber so you can get that validation that you're seeking from people whose opinion holds weight. Because why is some random person on the internet's opinion gonna matter to me? I want the validation from my peers because they think the same way I do. And let's be honest, a lot of the problem is the location of a lot of the stuff, because the validation is within the same thought process. And I'm talking within like the game industry as a location. That is a lot of the problem. People can't expand past that bubble that they decide to look at. I've been in the bubble, I've been out of the bubble. I'm kind of in between at the moment. I have no problem with what she's talking about. I think it's a needed discussion. But the industry is very, very bad at self-analyzation. They can, throw entitled gamer and all the other stuff that they want out at their very own readers, which I love. Or they can have an honest look at themselves. And it's not something that they do very often. Let's be real. Alanah is probably one of the few that have actually talked about this before. That, there are issues in the game industry that need to be addressed from top to bottom. And nobody discusses them. And the status quo is fine. We hear that with a lot of the stuff going on in the industry. Oh, the status quo, nothing's changed, yada, yada. And there hasn't been a lot of change. Self-analyzation from top to bottom on every facet is needed. From culture to things that we allow, things that we don't want any association with. But at the end of the day, you also have to be willing to look at yourself and how you contribute or you do not contribute to that structure, that culture that you may or may not like, or that status quo that you want to change or don't change. It all boils down to the people in the status quo. Do you want it changed or do you not?
You know what I was scared of, genuinely? The public. I didn't even think about EA. At no point did I think, oh no, EA is going to be mad at me if I tear this game apart. I don't care. I can also bet you that every outlet that gave this a 10 out of 10, in no part was like, Sony's gonna love us. They were probably more like, oh my god, the internet is going to fucking hate me, but I have to stick to my guns. Herein lies the problem, and the thing that I would ask of you, the internet. If you have opinions on review scores, and that someone gives something a score that doesn't align with what you think, but at the same time you're a person who wants writers to be honest, you kind of have to stop harassing those writers every time they write something that you personally don't agree with. Again, I know you don't want to hear this. I know that you would like this video more if I told you that IGN's reviews were paid off, which, dear God, would every journalist at that website ever have leaked it. Dan Stapleton is not the kind of man who's ever gonna fucking take... I never had anyone while I was there tell me to change a review score. They just asked what I thought. I was never swayed, not even one time. So if you complain about ethics in games journalism, or you want your writers to be honest, you can't at the same time harass them when they give a score that you don't like hearing, you know? That conflicts with itself in a way that seems very obvious to me, because again, I promise you, writers are so much more scared of the public than they are of publishers. And I guess it's just so weird from the writer's perspective, or from my perspective, even as someone who doesn't really give review scores anymore. I try to stay away from all that shit, because I can now. I hope to never do it again. To have people complain about ethics and honesty in review scores, but have them also yell when the review scores aren't the ones that they want to read. There are absolutely things that happen at each of these major websites that I think are worth looking at critically. I think IGN First is a bit shady. That is a thing where IGN gets very early access to games as like a cover story, Game Informer style, to do a bunch of previews. Previews are largely positive because you only really see the part of the game that the dev knows is going to be seen positively.
So for those that don't understand what the polished part of a game that she's talking about is what they call a vertical slice. It's that... It'll be that demo or that play that you get at a convention show. Usually it's just a vertical slice of a portion of the game. So, you know, this is where that PR comment comes in. So things like what she's talking about very much plays into the building the hype for a game, which to me makes sites like IGN culpable and not far off from just being an overglorified PR arm of a publisher. I mean, is it wrong?
But that exchange of access does mean it would be very complicated for the ongoing relationship of that month of IGN First or whatever it is, if you did say anything negative. I always feel like I was honest in every IGN First that I did. It was maybe 2 or 3. But it is hard to say that there wouldn't be some unconscious bias there that could potentially exist. Interpersonal relationships totally can be a concern. I'm not reviewing The Last of Us Part 2 because I'm friends with Troy Baker. I don't want to do it. It'd be weird. While I absolutely don't think that my relationship with Troy would in any way influence the way that I would review a game, I don't even want the public to have the ability to have that perception. I don't want to take a chance on that subconscious bias, you know? So I'm just not doing it. Relationships between writers and publishers and developers can be issues. Reviewers getting paid off.
And as I said earlier, that symbiotic relationship between publishers, writers, and developers is problematic, and it's not one that's ever addressed. Like the industry, like I talked about this 6 years ago when I was working in the industry, that there's a perception problem that the industry needs to fix. There's a willingness to engage with that perception problem that the industry doesn't want to fix. And then you have people in the industry who constantly bitch about that problem because they are unwilling to address it. And then when people within the industry do try to talk about it, the guy from Eurogamer who got thrown off Eurogamer, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, he just said something that it was a critical critique of the inside of the industry, and he got lambasted by every fucking writer and PR person up the wazoo. And it was a self-analyzation from an insider in the industry, and it was an honest one. But the industry didn't like what he had to say. You know, so sometimes, you know, we talk a lot about fundamental changes and self-reflection and a lot of the stuff in society. So why should games and games journalism and games media and publishers and developers and the culture within that sphere of fandom, arts, entertainment be any different than how we talk about the cracks and foundations in society, etc.? Interpersonal relationships are a problem. Relationships and the things that certain games media agree to, like embargoes, etc., access, developers and publishers requiring shit to have access, PR agencies gatekeeping and blocking. There's so much that people make it almost impossible. And the lack of transparency is a serious problem. And it really is one that needs to be addressed by the industry as a whole.
Not an issue. Reviewers giving games a 10 out of 10 because they care about a publisher? Not an issue. You'd maybe be worried if they gave The Last of Us Part 2 a 6. And if it is an issue, I think the public should be getting mad at the publishers for restricting access to journalists who are trying to give you the best idea of what a product is, in their opinion, so that you can make an informed purchasing decision. They are on your side. On to my third point, which
I will state, the interaction from those in those positions, the games media, they're not always on the consumer end and side of things. Well, let's just be blunt and honest here. Some people are fine with microtransactions. Some people are fine with DLC and pay to win and all. Take your pick. There's 7,000 other things that people are fine with. Then there are some people who aren't. That's going to depend across the board. But some in the industry do have a problem, and this is where that perception thing that you guys like, the industry doesn't want to talk about, and especially the games media, is the perception is they like to condescend and talk down to their audience. It's that condescending nature that creates the conflict between the gamer and the games media to begin with. And then, you have people wondering why gamers and readers get mad at games media, and game media gets mad at gamers. Because one condescends, the other condescends. Then it's just constant bickering, bitching fit up across the board. And you get nowhere. You get a big old dead man, no man's land. You got trench here. That's the warfare. That's a systemic issue in the industry from the gamer side and the games media side. Perception is key, and perception is the thing, and transparency is a thing, and willingness to engage and have these open and honest conversations are what is needed. This has been needed for far too long, and something that, again, I have nothing to complain about as far as from Alanah's perspective. I think it's an open and honest discussion, and that's why, yes, there's swearing on this, but her points are valid. She's giving a more recent insider view of the industry. I'm relating this to the gamer as that in between, because I've been on both sides.
I will talk about on my podcast that goes up on Fridays, Play, Watch, Listen, which is with Mike Bithell, who is a game director, Austin Wintory, who is a game composer, and Troy Baker, obviously video game actor. All
interpersonal relationships. And I applaud her for saying, fuck that, I'm not reviewing this game. That is understanding a perception. More people in the industry need to understand that.
All of those people who worked in the industry for a long time, I'm going to have them talk more about this, but I can touch on it. Game reviews do not contribute to sales in the way that the public seems to think they do. Frankly, the upset that spurts around game reviews is a little bit weird because of how truly unimportant they are in the grand scheme of things. They don't fucking matter. Yes, there are people who will tell you that they made a purchase based on a review. Those people exist, but the statistics show that in large part, game reviews do not influence sales. Frankly, press coverage in general doesn't influence sales. Myself and Tom Marks, I believe, worked together to write one of the first pieces about how bad Star Wars Battlefront 2 was initially in terms of microtransactions in the multiplayer. The internet seemed furious. They seemed so mad when that all came out. It took EA a few days and then they took them out, but they came back. And from the internet rhetoric around that, you would think that that game wasn't going to sell well. Sold great, didn't fucking matter. Didn't matter at all. Statistics have also shown, if you look up the news stories, you'll find them, that the leaks haven't influenced pre-orders for The Last of Us in any significant way. You'd think that they had, because when you're like very involved in games culture, it feels like the most important thing in the world. They haven't. It pre-ordered better than Spider-Man, which is one of the best-selling games on the platform of all time. And those pre-orders all happen before the reviews even go up. Reviews are just absolutely not as important to sales as I think the public thinks they are. And like I said, I will have people who actually work in the industry and actually have had a lot of stake in games being sold talk about that later this week, because while I have read up a lot about it and can tell you anecdotal experiences, I've not sold a video game.
So again, this is, and like she said, this is anecdotal. From what I've seen and what I've experienced, what basically happens is it's the buildup, it's the hype and the hype machine that the agencies and the PR relationships with, look at Watch Dogs in the press releases that were put out for that. There was so much hype for that game that if it didn't meet that expectation, it was gonna, from the graphics, etc., it was gonna piddle out. There are so many things that counteract a good game launch. Like, it's sad. To me, and to my point, is this is why when those press releases come out, and you read the same press release basically across every single website, when a game is announced or a game date is announced, it's the same press release. And hey, check out our previous coverage towards the end of the article. It's the same thing every time. It's just, it's news, quote unquote. It's announcements that any Joe Schmo with an internet connection and a critical thinking brain can, oh, that looks cool, that looks interesting. That's all it is. The games media's job at that point is just make it so it's word of mouth, make it so people buy the shit. Because you guys present the clicks, that's why. That is the reality. Build up hype at the base, then you build up hype in the mainstream. Simple marketing.
I don't feel like I should make a big point of talking about that. So yeah, try not to get too mad at me. Of course, I am on the inside. I only have an inside perspective. Back before I worked in the games industry, I was convinced game reviews were paid off too. And then I worked in the industry and I realized how dumb that was. And it is really, really just that people have different opinions. If you know that someone can like chocolate cake and another person can hate chocolate cake, it should make sense to you that someone can love The Last of Us Part 2 and someone can hate The Last of Us Part 2. They're just a mass of different opinions, I promise. So, in conclusion, 1. 10 out of 10 review score does not mean perfect, and a 5 does not mean average. 2. Writers are a lot more afraid of you than they are of publishers, and I would say most of them don't even think of publishers. If they do, they shouldn't be fucking working in the industry. 3. Review scores do not matter anywhere near as much as you think they do. I hope that I have explained my perspective here thoroughly. Please don't be too mad at me. I'm not trying to condescend or do anything like that. This is just a really loaded topic to talk about that people have very strong opinions on, and I am just trying to share a perspective that, again, I know this video would be more successful and I would get more subscribers and it would be shared on Reddit and it would be broken out into news stories and I would get a ton of views and make money if I told you that review scores are paid off, but it is simply not the truth. It is an easier thing for me to say, but it is simply not the truth. I do recognize that there are some ethical things that can influence review scores because humans are humans. There is no perfect way to do it, but I don't think giving The Last of Us Part 2 a 10 out of 10 means you're a Sony shill. I wouldn't have given it a 10, and I still know that this is just actually what Jonathan thinks. Okay, I'm very nervous to publish this one, but we're gonna do it because it feels like the right thing to do. Oh boy. I am also going to have a spoiler cast of The Last of Us Part 2 up later this week where I'm going to have myself being in the 7-8 range, 2 journalists who gave it a 5 out of 6 in their heads, and another 2 who gave it a 10 out of 10. So I'm going to have this like journalist battle royale where you can fully hear these people talk about their different impassioned perspectives live so that you like fully understand it. I feel like it's going to be really fun if I can actually pull it together without those people killing each other. Alrighty, everyone. I'm Alanah. I will see you guys next time. Bye.
So I want to commend Alanah for putting that video out. I know this video is really long. I don't actually expect her to watch this because like she's got far more important shit to do. But I think it's an honest discussion that needs to be happening, and I commend her for even bringing that discussion to the forefront. It's something that I've advocated for a long time. There are really big changes in the industry that need to happen. Metacritic being the bar needs to go away. People, the gaming culture as a whole, understanding that reviews are subjective in the guise of objectivity. People understanding that there's going to be a different take on stuff as far as like what they consider art, etc. Then there are things in the industry that need to be addressed from the inside the industry and not lambast people who attempt to address them. The interpersonal relationships between marketing and developers and publishers and games media, etc. And the stuff that games media agrees to, like embargoes, etc. There is a whole long line of things that need to be addressed. And it starts with conversations like these. So I hope this continues the conversation. Thank you again, Alanah, for having and being one of the few to really willing to actually have this conversation, because it is one that needs to be had, and the one the industry actually needs to be willing to be engaging in. And I hope it starts with you, and I hope it continues with others. So thank you.